Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Penn Vicarage on this Wednesday morning. Lovely to see you. Thank you, as always, for joining us for our Bible reflection today as we continue our adventure through the remarkable book of Exodus, which we started yesterday. So today we're in chapter 2, and without further ado, let's go straight into it. Exodus and chapter 2. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch, and put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse your child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. She took him as her son. She named him Moses because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to the people and saw their forced labour. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he saw 2 Hebrews fighting, and he said to the one who was in the wrong, "Why did you strike your fellow Hebrew?" He answered, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh. He settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. But some shepherds came and drove them away. Moses got up and came to their defense and watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come back to me so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian helped us against the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he? Why did you leave the man? Invite him to break bread." Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. She bore him a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, "I have been an alien residing in a foreign land." After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry of help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, so the context is that the people of God are in Egypt, and of course they got there thanks to Joseph and so on. But a few years later, we don't know how many years later, a new Pharaoh comes along who disapproves of them and finds them threatening and so on because they're flourishing under God's blessing, and tries to persecute them. He enslaves them, he kills the firstborn children, and eventually goes on to sort of kill the babies the male babies when they're born as well. So we've got this awful kind of situation of persecution and infanticide and so on. It's kind of a difficult picture. But this is the time when God's plan starts. And it's funny because it kind of always seems to start. There seems to be a theme here with the arrival of a baby. There seems to be a sort of sign that God's doing something. And it happens quite a lot. So before him you have Sarah, who couldn't give birth, of course, finds herself giving birth to Isaac, and likewise with Rachel giving birth to Jacob. You've also got Manoah's wife in the book of Judges, who's childless but eventually gives birth to Samson. You've got Hannah, of course, who's childless, and when God works, she gives birth to Samuel. And then in the New Testament, of course, you've got Elizabeth, who's childless, but she gives birth to John. And of course, Mary gives birth to Jesus unexpectedly as well. And here in this story, we have the arrival of a baby who, shall we say, unexpectedly survives by a kind of quirk of providence, if you like. ends up being floated down the river in this basket. And it's interesting, isn't it, really, that he is spared a watery death by travelling on like, if you like, an ark. And it's not unlike the ark, of course, which happened under Noah to save all the people in chapter 6 of Genesis. Here you have a baby being saved, if you like, from a watery death as well. And so, in a sense, you can think of Moses' basket as a bit like Noah's ark. You know, he was saved from a watery death and he was carried to safety, and by a kind of bizarre quirk of God's providence, you end up with an interesting situation that in the midst of all this Egyptians persecuting the Hebrews, you end up with a Hebrew boy being brought up as a prince in Egypt. And that's kind of what happens. He gets brought up in Pharaoh. A Hebrew boy from the royal house of Judah, of course, ends up being brought up as a prince in Egypt. So we've got this incredible situation. Such is the incredible work of God. So that is, in a sense, God working here, as I say. So you end up in the midst of, despite all this persecution, you end up with a Hebrew boy being brought up as a prince in Egypt. And that's kind of what you get in the first few verses of it. Then, of course, Moses kind of grows up and he realizes that obviously God's doing something in him. And eventually he sees an Egyptian beating up a Hebrew. And he sort of looks this way and that to make sure no one's watching, and then he kills him and buries him, thinks he's got away with it. I think he probably knew somehow that he was going to do something remarkable. God was going to do something through him. But it's interesting that it just wasn't the right time. I mean, God did, of course, in the burning bush, but that's 40 years later, I think you'll find. We'll come to that in a couple of chapters' time. But it just wasn't God's timing. Moses had to have, and ends up spending several years out there in the desert, being prepared. But interesting enough, it wasn't lost time, because he ends up going into the desert, the family of Ruel, and he finds a wife, Zipporah, who becomes his kind of wife for life. So he's struck too soon. He didn't wait on God's time. Moses acted off his own volition, if you like, but didn't wait on God. And God did do great things for Moses, but not for another 40 years or so. And so I think sometimes we act in our own time, but we need to learn to act in God's time, that God knows what he's doing. And it can be frustrating sometimes, and you know that this is, but actually it's not just when, it's not just how you do something and the fact God things happen, but it's God's timing as well. And here Moses just jumped too soon. So he ends up having to spend 40 years in the desert. But it's not wasted time. He does meet his wife there, which is great. But then finally, in the last few verses as well, verse 23, I think this is really key. That after the king of Egypt died, the Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out to God. And it's interesting because it says that God heard their groaning, that they'd been persecuted for this time, they'd had an awful time, but their prayers had not gone unanswered, that God had heard their prayers, that when they cried out to God, God had actually heard. And it sort of says so in the last 3 or 4 verses of Genesis chapter 2, that God heard their groaning, and that God was the right time was kind of now, and that God was going to do something, but it had to be in God's time. So in the first few verses, you've got this persecuting situation going on. God's going to do something, but there seems to be a common theme throughout the Bible that when a baby is born, it's almost a sign that something good's going to happen. Think of Christmas. I mean, the unexpected birth of a child does seem to be often the sign in the Bible that God is doing something great. But of course, you ended up through this incredible situation with a Hebrew boy being brought up as a prince in Egypt, which is remarkable despite this, in view of the situation that they were in. Secondly, it's about we need to learn the importance of waiting on God's time. That Moses did in a sense what he was going to do later, but he did it too soon. He did it in his time. He needs to learn, as we all do, to wait on God's time. But then finally to learn that in the midst of their pain, God heard their groans. God heard their cry. And actually God hears our cries today. That when we cry out to God, God's not unmoved. God does not care. God is not deaf. God hears us. And God heard the people then. And God hears the people now. Lots in that chapter, and a lot more I'm sure we could mention, we could talk about as well. But have a lovely day, my friends. God bless you. Hope you find that helpful. Tomorrow, chapter 3. Bless you. Thanks for watching. Do share this message with your